Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this month's session of the CRITT Translation Colloquium. My name is Ali Saidi and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Just before we start, I would like to let you know that the format of this session is similar to a conference presentation. So we will be listening to our guest speaker's presentation uninterruptedly, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. That being said, the topic for today's presentation is Rethinking Translation Expertise, a Workplace Perspective. In this talk, our guest speaker will walk us through a research project that aims to contribute to the understanding of how translation expertise is seen and constructed in translation practice. As for our guest speaker today, she is Professor for Translation Studies at the Center for Translation Studies at the University of Vienna, Austria. Her previous positions include Professor for Translation Studies at the University of Graz, Professor for Applied Cognitive Science and Technical Communication at the Danube University Krems, Guest Professor at the University of Aarhus, Denmark, and Lecturer at the University of Skövde, Sweden. Her research areas include cognitive scientific foundations of translation, cognitive ethnography, and translation workplace and network research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hanna Risku. Professor, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here at the Kent State University and CRITT Center. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. So let me just show you my slides. There you go. Okay. Hope that's well visible for everyone. Okay.
Yes,
so I'm going to thank you. I'm going to tell you about the research project that we are just planning, and this research project will be financed by FWF, the Austrian Science Foundation, Wissenschaftsfonds, and it will enable me and my research group, which is at the University of Vienna, SOCO-Trans, Social Cognitive Translation Studies. It will enable us to study translation expertise. And I will be studying it together with Daniela Schlager, Jelena Milosevic, and Regina Rogel. And I will be telling you about our motivation to this research project today. The notion of translation expertise has been a topic of interest in translation studies, particularly within translation process research for many decades already. Over the past 20 years, intense research efforts, particularly within the field of translation process research, have produced valuable insights into the skills required of translators. Most of the empirical research to date has been conducted in laboratory settings and seek, for example, to examine cognitive differences between translators with different levels of expertise and experience. Theoretical conceptualizations have been inspired primarily by expertise studies in cognitive psychology. The aim of our new research project is to extend the concept of translation expertise to include a performative situated perspective based on a workplace study, a qualitative workplace study, and explore its significance, the significance of expertise in authentic, complex, and dynamic workplace settings. Particular focus will be based on the social discursive construction of expertise and experts. So what makes a good translator? In 1984, Justa Holz-Menteri described translation as an action requiring expertise and carried out by experts. It's Expertenhandeln. Since then, and even earlier, there has been an ongoing discussion in the translation studies field about whether every bilingual or multilingual individual can actually translate or interpret. Most scholars have suggested that additional skills are required and that a person needs certain translation competence or expertise in order to be able to work professionally as a translator. Accordingly, research has largely centered on the aspects that make up such competence, expertise, or professionalism. And these three terms have been frequently used interchangeably, which has also led to discussions about their similarities and differences. Some recent publications call for distinctions between these concepts. Several studies have shown that professionals do not always produce high-quality translations, which is why Jääskeläinen, for example, suggests distinguishing between professional translators who earn their living as a translator and expert translators with high performance quality. For a long time, the term competence dominated the discussions about the skills required by translators. Initial research was carried out in the 1970s, for example, by Wills, whose concept of translation competence was strongly influenced by Chomsky's generative grammar and focused on linguistic skills. Many different definitions and models have since been followed and it developed and have progressively included an increasing number of factors beyond language. These increasingly comprehensive models were often motivated by pedagogics and, according to their critics, became less conclusive with increasing scope. Some of the multi-component models like Pacte Group and my model emphasize the process-like character of competence, doing and experiencing, and demonstrate strong similarities to the performance-based approach used in expertise research. Shreve and others propose replacing the linguistically oriented concept of competence with the expertise framework from cognitive psychology. The cognitive psychological approach to studying expertise evolved from research on exceptionally good performance and performers in domains such as sports and chess, and focuses mainly on problem solving and speed. According to Shreve and others, its more robust theoretical and empirical foundation gives it a number of advantages over the concept of competence. And the expertise framework now forms the basis of several translation process research approaches. In the expertise studies paradigm, an expert is often defined as someone who displays consistently superior performance on a specified set of representative tasks for the domain. Expertise is the entire set of cognitive resources and abilities that allow consistently reproducible expert performance. It is also described as something that is acquired over time, so as opposed to being an innate characteristic. The learning process is central to expertise, and while experience also plays a major role, this applies only for the type of experience that is characterized by deliberate practice, which is a key concept in expertise studies. This regular engagement in specific activities directed at performance enhancement in a particular domain, as Shreve defines it, is assumed to be what makes the difference between experts and experienced non-experts. So deliberate practice would explain why experienced working professionals do not always produce high quality translations or other products. Accordingly, not all experienced translators are expert translators. Only those who have engaged in deliberate practice and who display this kind of consistently superior performance. Much of the research on translation expertise has, however, experience as the main criterion for the selection of study participants. The studies observe and compare the actions of translators with different levels of experience, such as translation experts, semi-professional translators, novices, or students. In this view, experts are not necessarily top performers, but rather the more knowledgeable group. Their expertise is thus relative, whereas the study of absolute expertise would focus on truly exceptional performers and measurable peak performance. Since absolute experts are difficult to identify in the field of translation, it is only logical that empirical research to date has focused on relative expertise. Such comparative studies are conducted mainly in experimental controlled settings using data acquisition methods such as eye tracking, think aloud protocols, screen logging, and keystroke logging. They have served to identify a number of indicators that characterize the differences between novices and experienced professionals. And more experienced translators have been found, for example, to process larger sections of text, use more reference material, and exhibit higher degrees of automation, task awareness, target text and context orientation, self-monitoring, and self-evaluation than their novice counterparts. However, these aspects offer merely a brief indication of what translation expertise can mean, a fact that is highlighted, for example, by Ricardo Munoz Martin. He adopts a situated cognition perspective and presents a multidimensional model of translation expertise, which consists of general and task-specific competences or dimensions of expertise. With his reconceptualization, Munoz Martin takes a step towards embedding the expertise construct in a dynamic and context-specific working reality of translators. He underlines the importance of the increased focus on adaptability. While expertise research traditionally assumes that expertise is limited to a particular domain and is not transferable, adaptability or adaptive expertise assumes a key role in the wide-ranging and dynamic fields of activity that come into play in the translation sector. Translation expertise could thus be regarded as the maximal adaptation to task constraints. A situated, embodied and multidimensional concept of translation expertise will not only enable new and nuanced insights in laboratory research, it also creates a foundation for corresponding field research. Research that draws on authentic workplace settings is not yet a firmly grounded or established tradition in translation and interpreting studies, although it has gained considerable ground in recent years, especially in sociological and cognitive translation research. A key aspect of workplace research is that single texts, individual translators, or isolated processes are replaced as units of analysis by real-life workplaces, be they home offices or freelance translators, language service agencies, in-house translation departments, or even virtual translation networks. The main advantages of this approach are its high ecological validity, and the extension of the scope of the research to include the social, material, institutional, and technological factors, for example, that influence translators and translation processes at the workplace. The theoretical frameworks used are mainly inspired by cognitive science, sociology, and more recently also ergonomics. So also scholars draw on theories such as situated cognition, actor network theory, practice theory, and organizational studies or ergonomics theories. A variety of methods, both qualitative and quantitative, can be used for workplace research, all of which differ in their degree of formalization, specificity, and involvement in the field. In order to grasp as many relevant aspects as possible, workplace research is often ethnographically oriented. Entering the workplace and being immersed in the field enables the researcher to approximate the emic or the insider view. And here, participant observations, interviews, artifact analysis, document analysis, and so on, those are the most common methods used. However, approaches that are quantitative or more distant from the field, such as questionnaires, are also possible in workplace research. In addition, ethnographic methods can be combined, if possible, with traditional translation process research methods, such as keystroke or screen logging, eye tracking, or even laboratory experiments for triangulation of data. The image of translation work that emerges from such studies differs considerably from the stereotypical notion of the individual translator sitting alone in an office in front of a computer. There is a common recognition that both the work environment and the tasks of translators have changed dramatically in the recent years, and they are constantly being restructured by globalization, digitalization, and the network economy. These changes can be seen in the increasing heterogeneity of the tasks performed, the work processes, the cooperation forms, the tools used, and they show a move from the individual to a network level. Modern day organizational structures tend to be decentralized and include the outsourcing and offshoring of translation services. In-house positions for translators are losing ground to cooperations with agencies and freelance translators. And translation expertise does not remain untouched by these dynamics and the recent changes they have brought to the workplace. This calls for research on expertise in lived work, as it is lived as part of organizational life by those who do it, as Button and Harper define it or describe it. While current key topics in translation studies workplace research include work organization and routines, cognitive and organizational and physical ergonomics, the use and implications of technologies, and operation and social dynamics, they do not yet really extend to expertise. In fact, compared to the wealth of experiment-based studies on translation competence and expertise, studies on lived translation expertise are few and far between. In contrast to ethic perspectives of the researchers, very little is as yet known about how those who actually work in the translation sector conceptualize expertise. The few studies that have been carried out in this area by translation studies scholars reveal a somewhat different picture to the ones accessed by theoretical or experimental expertise research. For example, the translators and project managers who participated in the survey by Angelone and Marin Garcia focus more strongly on handling matters relating to the work context and parameters, like punctuality, interaction, and dialogue, than on the quality of the work or even top performance. They consider quantitative productivity at least as important as quality in the sense of a high value, well-functioning product. Also, the study shows the high importance of adaptability on a variety of levels. The activities the translators are engaged in are numerous and diverse. Not only do they sometimes translate, of course, outside their areas of specialization, they also view their job as including proofreading, editing, localization, and so on. So they and also they have to adapt to different kinds of media, clients, and the particular expectations of the clients. So these results support a reconceptualization of translation expertise. First, they demonstrate that adopting the lived work perspective offers strong potential for gaining new insights. Secondly, there is the question of the importance of understanding expertise and above all, understanding expertise also and above all as a social construction. This calls for an examination of the factors that bring about the different conceptualizations. Thirdly, it becomes apparent that translation can be perceived as a dynamic, collaborative activity involving several people with different ideas and expectations. The EMIC understanding, the insider understanding of expertise held by working professionals relates primarily to expertise in context. The context does not have to be limited to workplace settings. It can be extended further, as shown, for example, by Ein and Ian. Their study is based on interviews with volunteer translators in an LGBTIQ migrant community translation project. Some of these volunteers consider themselves translation experts, and some do not. And the study reveals the discourses by which both groups construct the boundaries between experts and lay people. N and N's theoretical approach is inspired by sociology of science, and they draw on the notion of boundary work. They argue that the common distinction in translation studies between professionals or experts and amateur translators or lay people should be questioned. They also note that the research focus on professional translators fails to consider the majority of translation activities, that is, those that take place outside a professional context. They suggest distinguishing between a conceptualization of expertise that relates to the construction of identities through boundary work, and one that relates to specific translation practices, describing the latter as knowledge practices. That is the sort of knowledge that is rather performed than possessed. This N and N's approach brings together two dimensions of expertise that at first glance do not seem so compatible. Expertise is seen on the one hand primarily as a social construct, a view that is shared mainly in sociological research into expertise, professionalism, and also elites. Yet, on the other hand, N and N do not disregard the idea that people engage in certain practices that enable them to perform their task successfully, whatever success is understood to mean in that context. The notion of knowledge practices displays many parallels to Munoz-Marin's concept of situated expertise and also Maeve Olohan's practice theory perspective on knowledge. Translation studies scholars and professional translators have, of course, engaged in boundary work and tried to establish a discourse of occupational control. However, given the status of translation and translators, these efforts do not yet appear to have been very successful. While separating experts from non-experts establishes professional identities and institutionalizes a profession, translation does not yet formally qualify as such. It is still in the process of professionalization. What is more, there is a considerable difference between the way translators see themselves and how they are perceived by others. Many translators complain about low levels of appreciation, status, and pay. These conditions might be explained by an successful discourse on translation expertise. So our perspective on expertise as a social and discursive construct is also relevant for scholars and translators who are interested in the professionalization of translation. The arguments I have presented now lead to some key assumptions for the study of lived expertise. First, while translation process research has so far mostly described expertise as a system of internal mental processes, research on lived expertise will also need to include social, performative, and situated aspects. Particular importance should be attached to the emic perceptions of the people who actually work with translation, so both professional and volunteer and amateur translators, for example. To include those volunteers and amateurs and so on, work can be understood as an activity that involves providing a service or producing goods for others, regardless if it is paid or not. So in this perspective, being an expert would not describe an idealized state at the end of a long learning process. It would mean being a social actor, ascribed the label of expert. In a similar vein, Kiraly refers to translator competence instead of translation competence. Expert performance is not seen as measurable, consistently reproduced superior performance in a certain domain, but kind of as a play that occurs in interaction with other social actors who constantly negotiate their positions and discursively reconstruct expertise. Another important aspect is the view of expertise as multiple and partial. This relates to the manifold knowledge practices that translators might or might not engage in, and the diverse expert roles that might or might not be attributed to them. For example, someone could be seen as a language expert, but not as a translation expert or a subject expert. This involvement of many different people with different backgrounds suggests a variety of possible conceptualizations of expertise, rendering this co-construction even more complex. So combining the notion of adaptability with the social dynamics of the co-construction of expertise leads in turn to the necessity of the ability to adapt to the different conceptualizations of expertise. Compared to existing research on expertise in translation studies, this represents a shift in focus from products or processes to people. People thus supersede texts and internal processes in that case. In this light, expertise could be seen as something that occurs in interaction And there are also ideological interests linked to the discourse of expertise, in particular with regard to the function of social closure. When all these considerations are taken into account, one approach seems to be particularly suitable for research into lived expertise, which is the ethnographic perspective. Ethnographic research generally involves some form of being immersed in the field of study, kind of being there. This allows the authenticity of the target situation to be maintained. Prototypical translation settings can be found at the workplace of professional translators, and much of the workplace research in translation studies is indeed ethnographically oriented. Examples include studies on institutional translation, the ergonomics of translation work in translation agencies, theater translation, freelance translation, translation project management, literary translation, and so on. However, none of these ethnographic workplace studies to date have focused explicitly on translation expertise. So, to ensure an ethnographic approach to our research, we will try to approximate the insider view as far as possible. But the purpose of the planned research project is exploratory. We will not strive for generalization, but for multifaceted, deep and close analysis of very few selected cases. And this requires, as Kaisa Koskinen describes it, engagement with the object of study, going into the field, and the willingness to learn from those who inhabit the culture. To bridge the gap between expertise and workplace research, we will take the following into account. First of all, construction. Here are a lot of research questions coming in. What does expertise, competence, or professionalism mean for the social actors involved? Do people working with translation distinguish between different constructs, or do they consider them all to be the same? Who is considered an expert or a professional, and why? Which aspects of behavior are considered more important? Do these aspects reflect any findings from expertise research, for example, this superior performance, expertise indicators, or deliberate practice? Which skills are considered necessary? On what basis are arguments formed? Is it, for example, market expectations, universities or professional associations, company policy, or is it personal work ethics? The second factor would be practice. How do these constructions manifest themselves in actions, work processes, and also in the organizational structures? What consequences does this have for day-to-day working practice? How do translators navigate through their tasks? How do they interact with other people and tools? Also, the function of expertise. Which ideological or other interests lie behind the expertise discourse? Is it used strategically, for example, for the purpose of self-legitimization, to create power structures, or to institutionalize the profession? Or is it used instrumentally, for example, just to select translators for projects? What is said to whom and what is not said to whom? Also, the contradictions and conflicts here. In which do the manifestations and constructions of expertise overlap and differ? What are the differences between what people do and what they say they do? Are there tensions and conflicts that arise from differences between self-perception and external perception? If so, how are they dealt with? And last but not least, our research will have to take the various social actors with their different positions and their collaboration into account. Our interest lies in the non-literary translation production networks. Accordingly, our aim is to gain access to several translation agencies, for example, along with some of their freelance translators. Of course, gaining access to the field is a key issue in any ethnographic study and will present one of the first and main challenges for our study. Translation agencies who will provide us with open access to work situations must first be identified and contacted. Formal negotiations with decision makers, maybe on different levels, will be necessary. And trust is a major issue, not only in regard to decision makers, but also to all other participants. The persons studied should be willing to participate anonymously in the observations, interviews, and focus groups, and provide open access to data. We will use a combination of participant observation, focus groups, interviews, and artifact analysis to collect data. By using several methods, we will try to capture different dimensions of translation expertise. That is, normative descriptions like explicit requirements, instructions, and guidelines. Then also the actual workplace praxis observed and the interpretations or rationalizations of the various social actors involved. We will use interviews and focus groups to give the participants a voice and a platform to express their own perspectives on translation expertise. These data collection methods shift the power from the researcher to the participants. And we plan to carry out interviews with translator project managers and CEOs and split these into two phases. Initially, we will conduct narrative interviews, which enable the participants to speak freely about those aspects that they consider important, and we will try to identify the main topics from the data gathered in these first interviews, and then generate first theses. And after that, we will carry out a series of more structured interviews to obtain specific insights. The strong interactive factor of focus groups offers some advantages, I hope. Through the discussions with the group, data on opinions can emerge that might otherwise not be articulated. We will conduct separate focus groups, if possible, with translators, translation project managers, CEOs of translation agencies, and preferably also with representatives of professional translator associations. Participant observations can give us access to otherwise inaccessible areas of work and allow us to capture as many of the practices as possible firsthand. Throughout the entire process, we will collect any documents that seem relevant for the construction of expertise. That is, websites, correspondence, job vacancies, internal guidelines, checklists, feedback, and statements about job application procedures. An analysis of such materials hopefully offers insights into norms that guide work realities and expectations of future employees, and the image mediated to the outside world. So, to conclude, linking expertise and workplace research will hopefully enable us to address a research gap that has already been identified by several translation scholars. To date, there is a lack of qualitative empirical data available on translation expertise, which indicates the visible social practices as well as the discursive rationalizations of the relevant actors. Initial insights into the lived expertise of working professionals promise new perspectives for translation studies and harbor the potential for a theoretical reconceptualization of the notion of translation expertise. Such a reconceptualization may also prove relevant in a number of other knowledge-intensive and technology-supported service industries. So I think that the idea of rethinking translation expertise has great potential both in and beyond translation studies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Risku, for this insightful presentation. So now we open the floor for questions. Okay, we have the first question here. Barbara Heinz. Yes, please, go ahead, Barbara. Barbara? Can you open your mic?
The question is from Ying Mai.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Yang Mai is saying very interesting. So translation expertise includes not only translation ability, but also the ability to communicate and cooperate with other agents, players in the network, to use tools, and so on. Question mark.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I would say, and I would say that as actually that is translation expertise, or that is part of the ability to translate, because when you think of translation as work, it doesn't begin when you have the source text and you start translating, but there's so much more that's happening before that, and the whole environment includes or is involved in the translation process. So yes, there are these negotiations with others and processes of checking terms and talking to other people, revision processes, being able to react to criticism, and so on and so on. So I think that's actually part of the ability to translate and the translation expertise. Yes.
Thank you. We have another question from Juf Kabi, and it is: would you make a distinction between translation expertise in the narrow sense of transfer skill versus professional business skills?
You can, of course, you can make a difference between being able to do things with language, write texts, and so on. But if we think of translation expertise as something where you really have to fill that role and the position of an expert, then that, of course, that's not enough. So you will need these professional and business skills as well. Otherwise, you will not even come into the situation of getting translation orders. You will not be able to survive in that role. And the idea is that maybe being a translation expert means being able to survive in that role, in that position.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you can always open the mic and make your comment or question. Feel free to do that as well. So back to Yang Mi, she's saying maybe you can different private translation companies and government institutional translators? Question mark.
Yes, I think, of course, in both these contexts, expertise and expert translators will be necessary and will have different kinds of abilities and roles. Absolutely. So you will need to differentiate. Yes, yes. I think that's something that maybe also in translation studies programs we can put more, or people do that, of course, already, but we should stress that ability to adapt to these different organizational contexts. I think that's so important for our graduates, that they understand and that they are empowered to do so. And they understand what kind of challenges they have in these different positions and in these different kinds of companies and organizations.
Mm-hmm. Saeed Amri is asking, can we examine translation expertise in terms of fan subbing, fan dubbing, or any forms of amateur translation?
Of course, we can and we should. I think there's so much expertise, so there's so much knowledge and practices and really interesting things going on there. If you think of the technology enhancement, the automation, multimediality, the collaborative work that is going on there, the motivations of people doing it when they don't get paid, all those factors, I think that's extremely interesting, and there's a lot that we can learn from those fan subbers. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Tiago Moreira has a comment. He says, with regards to the function of expertise, I would add that it is widely considered among translators, clients, and managers as a tool characteristic for selecting, validating, and arguing translation options, particularly where there is no consensus for terminology.
The function of expertise. Yes. I'm not quite sure what your question is here, but yes, of course, expertise and ascribing the role of expert to some people and not to others is used very strategically in order to in business contexts and in other contexts in order to legitimize this position for some people and not for others. And I think you mentioned there's no consensus for terminology. Yes, so for example, clients in a prior study of ours, in one company, the client was very clear that, of course, their experts, their subject experts, are the ones to decide on terminology. And no matter what the translators might have seen in terms of consistency or inconsistency or whatever, the clients was very clear that their subject matter experts as revisers will have the say. So they were given the power to decide on to have the final decision on terminology. Yes.
Mm. And Eric Angelon saying, thank you, Hanna. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hanna, for this talk. I am wondering which artifacts in particular have to be most insightful and how one can circumvent or mitigate constraints like non-disclosure agreements in accessing them.
How you mean what kind of artifacts might be given access to in our empirical research? Those that would be insightful in terms of translation expertise. I wonder if that's the question. Of course, yeah, I think maybe Eric wants to ask himself.
Hi, Hanna. Yeah, I was just wondering in
Yes,
terms
please.
of the artifacts,
Dr.
which ones have proven to be most insightful? And then how can you get around some of the inherent constraints in an LSP setting, like non-disclosure agreements?
Oh, yes. When we do ethnographic research, of course, we cannot ask, for example, all the clients whether their texts, we can use their texts as our material in our research. So we will have to be very clear to differentiate between the data that we are given open access to and other kind of data, for example, regarding the clients. So so that's clearly a thing that we will have to keep in mind, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, in workplace settings, we would not be able to use original texts, do text analysis, and show texts in our research papers, because it might become visible who the clients were, and the clients might have never been asked whether they want to participate in our research. So that's certainly a problem. But I think the network that we will be studying, including even one single translation agency, is actually such a huge network that getting access to their software, their correspondence, their kind of working, interviewing them and looking at their guidelines and their websites and whatever is in the office and publicly available will already be so much that it's always a huge challenge to be able to handle that amount of data.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Angelon. So Ibrahim also has a question. He says, by zooming out, do you see the amateurs, experienced translators, experts as parts of a ladder where the experts are at the top? If so, how or when can we move up the ladder?
I would not really. Actually, I would say no. I don't see that as a ladder. It's not that self-evident, let's say so. Of course, we can see, for example, in our study programs, we can see people coming in and not having any translation experience, and then learning about translation and getting more experience and getting work experience too. So, of course, there's that kind of a development. We hope to have that kind of a development that might be also described as a ladder. But on the other hand, there are a lot of amateurs, a lot of experienced translators that have years and years of experience in translation. And I would not say that there are self-evident, clear criteria that you can use and say that, you know, here are the experts and here are not the experts, because if you use that kind of a performative definition of expertise. And on the other hand, what I'm interested in is exactly that. What kind of ladders do we have in our minds when we think of these different people? Do we see them, and who sees them in which order and why? So that's one of the research questions actually of the research project. Not us defining that, but trying to find out how people define these relations.
So this is Jeff Kobe. If I could follow up on that. I think what you're getting at is that expertise, particularly translation expertise, is very multifaceted, as we know from the many different components of, for instance, the EMT program, the European Masters in Translation. So a professional translator will be have expertise in perhaps a specific domain of translation. I would happily translate your contracts from German to English, but I will not translate your medical report, for instance. And that leads me to a question then. Would you be trying to access, for instance, boutique translation agencies, which generally are focusing more on high quality translation and maybe recruiting these experts, as opposed to a larger translation agency that's going more for a middle of the market? I think that might make a difference.
It will certainly make a difference, and I think it's such a huge task planning such a project. I'm so thankful that we get the finance for 3 researchers for 3 years, but I realize that that's in no way enough to somehow get a comprehensive picture of the field, because as you say, also you mentioned AMT, which is very professionally and also study program oriented. We don't really know for what kind of positions we are educating our students for. What are the work realities that they will be involved in, and it's huge. It's so many media languages, also in trilingual translation and accessibility that is coming into the field of translation even more. So it's a huge field, and I have been actually in the last project that we had a bit of a similar project, but more concentrating on translation processes and cognitive translation studies. We had 4 cases. One was a case with 2 freelancers who worked at home and also corrected each other's texts. But they were I think you mentioned boutique translators. And we had one translation agency, very technology oriented, of course, also mass production of translation. We had one translation department in a public sector organization, and we had a technology company that outsources translation, most of the translation work. So even in that project, we had 4 very, very different settings, and I really have to admit that I haven't really decided. We will start with this new project in the fall, in autumn, and we will be then looking for cases, for settings to study. And we originally thought of translation agencies to look at, but maybe there's already such a variety in the forms of translation agencies that we can just concentrate on those, and then still have this variety of different contexts and different work realities and qualities and so on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kobe. So we have another question from Felix Del Carmo. For expertise to be different from competence existing in amateur practice, Maybe the main criteria are consistency, deliberateness, both only existing in a continuous work practice. Is the purpose of this to distinguish those that are translators from those that do translations?
I think that's again something that we will be looking at. So our open research question will be the question, how do people who are somehow involved in translation practice, how do they distinguish between those that are translators from those who do translations? So it would, in that case, again, not be us saying that what it is. We can only say how that has been distinguished in translation studies. Of course, there are definitions already, but we would try to find out how people working in the field actually make these distinctions.
Thank you. Yang Mi has another question. How many translation companies are investigated to get valid results on the condition that your research is manageable?
Well, since our research project will be an ethnographic research project, it could be just one translation company, because the idea is to go very deep and get insights into that one context and one setting, and to understand where does it come from, why are the people acting the way they do, what kind of concepts do they use, and so on. So it's a huge thing to try to understand comprehensively and deeply that one single case. But we will try to have, I think, 3 cases of that kind, and I would really like to have them have different cases, those that can show, this huge field of translation, what it is made of, all the variety of translation contexts. So this question of how many is that it's a very small numbers that we will be looking at, but it will be, of course, many interviews, probably lasting more than 1 hour, and having that kind of interviews with the same person several times, and looking at them for several weeks, sitting behind them in their office for several weeks during their work. So that's the idea in our research project. This question of how many cases you need to get valid results in a quantitative study, for example, a questionnaire, would be something totally different. Of course, you would need the numbers of the whole population, and then think about whether you want to be representative, have your questionnaire a representative questionnaire or not, and so on. Of course, in translation process research, I have to say the numbers have been quite small, even in quantitative research, of course, because experimental research, we kind of, even in that context, we have been, or people have been testing the methods, what kind of data acquisition and analysis methods can we actually use in order to get insights into the translation process. But I hope that in that quantitative tradition, of course, it will be possible to have larger numbers, but I'm not the right person to know how many you will need.
Thank you. So any more questions, follow-ups? Okay. So I guess then this concludes this very engaging question and answer session. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Hanna Risku, for your time and for this interesting presentation and answering all these questions. And with that, we conclude this session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. You as well. Bye-bye.